When 34-year-old Marcus Whitfield inherited his grandfather's crumbling 127-acre farmhouse in rural Clarksville, Tennessee, his siblings' cruel laughter echoed through the mahogany-paneled probate office until demolition crews discovered a sealed vault buried 40 feet beneath the rotting floorboards, containing Civil War artifacts and gold reserves worth over $300 million. The reading of Ezra, Whitfield's last will and testament, had taken place on a suffocating August morning in 2023, when the humidity hung over Davidson County like a wet blanket, and the air conditioning in attorney Margaret Chun's office wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. Marcus sat in the far corner of the conference room, his work-worn hands folded in his lap, while his older siblings occupied the premium seats closest to the polished oak table, where their grandfather's final wishes would be revealed. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Victoria Whitfield Sterling, 42, adjusted her Hermes scarf and checked her Rolex for the third time in 10 minutes. As the regional director for a Fortune 500 consulting firm based in Nashville, she radiated the kind of polished confidence that came from never having to worry about money. Her husband, Jonathan Sterling, sat beside her scrolling through emails on his iPhone, occasionally glancing up with the barely concealed impatience of someone accustomed to closing million-dollar real estate deals before lunch. Across from them, Rebecca Whitfield Morrison, 38, whispered something to her husband Daniel that made them both chuckle softly. Rebecca had parlayed her marketing degree from Vanderbilt into a successful digital agency that specialized in luxury brand campaigns. Her designer handbag cost more than Marcus made in 2 months, and she had the kind of manicured fingernails that had never touched soil or machinery. The family lawyer, Margaret Chun, cleared her throat and adjusted her reading glasses. She had been handling the Whitfield family's legal affairs for nearly 2 decades, and her expression suggested someone who had presided over more than her share of family drama, disguised as estate planning. "Before we begin," Chun announced, her voice carrying the professional neutrality of someone who had learned not to show favoritism in matters of inheritance, "I want everyone to understand that Ezra Whitfield was very specific about his intentions. He spent considerable time crafting this document, and he asked me to read it exactly as written, without editorial comment." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, already sensing the tension building in the room like pressure before a thunderstorm. His grandfather had been a man of few words but strong convictions, and Marcus suspected that those convictions were about to create some uncomfortable conversations. "To my granddaughter Victoria," Chun began reading, "who has built a successful career in business consultation, I leave my collection of first edition business and economics textbooks, along with the sum of $50,000 to be invested according to her considerable expertise in financial planning." Victoria smiled with satisfaction, though Marcus noticed the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. $50,000 was respectable, but it was hardly the kind of inheritance that would change someone's lifestyle, especially someone accustomed to Victoria's standard of living. "To my granddaughter Rebecca," Chun continued, "who has demonstrated exceptional creativity in her marketing endeavors, I leave my grandfather's Civil War sword collection and historical documents, along with the sum of $50,000 to support her continued success in business." Rebecca nodded approvingly, already calculating how the antique weapons might be incorporated into her home's decor or potentially sold to collectors for additional value. Like Victoria, she seemed pleased but not particularly surprised by the bequest. Marcus felt his stomach tightening as Chun turned to the next page of the will. He had expected to receive some token inheritance, perhaps a few $1,000s or some of his grandfather's farming equipment, but he hadn't dared hope for anything substantial. His relationship with Ezra had been different from his siblings, built more on shared labor than shared conversation, and he wasn't sure how that translated into legal documents. To my grandson Marcus, Chun read, her voice taking on a slightly different tone, who alone among my grandchildren has shown respect for the land that has sustained our family for 4 generations, I leave the entirety of my real property, including the family farmhouse, all outbuildings, farm equipment, and the complete 127 acres of Whitfield Farm, along with all mineral rights, water rights, and any other natural resources contained therein. The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear the air conditioning cycling on again and the distant sound of traffic from Church Street. Victoria's mouth had fallen slightly open, while Rebecca had gone very still in the way that people do when they're trying to process information that doesn't match their expectations. Jonathan Sterling was the first to speak, his real estate agent instincts apparently overriding his social discretion. Margaret, what's the current assessed value of that property? Chun consulted another document. According to the most recent county assessment, the land is valued at approximately $1.2 million, though that doesn't account for the condition of the structures, which would require significant investment to bring up to modern standards. Victoria found her voice, and it carried an edge that Marcus had heard many times during their childhood whenever she felt she'd been treated unfairly. I'm sorry, but this doesn't make sense. Marcus has never shown any interest in maintaining property or running a business. He's been bouncing between construction jobs and farm work for the past 15 years. Victoria, Marcus started, but she continued as if he hadn't spoken. Grandfather was clearly not thinking rationally in his final years. Marcus lives in a rental apartment in town and drives a pickup truck that's older than some of my employees. What's he going to do with 127 acres and a house that's probably been condemned by the county? Rebecca leaned forward, her marketing background apparently providing her with ammunition for the family dispute. Margaret, is there any provision for contesting this will? Because honestly, this seems like a decision made by someone who wasn't considering the practical implications of property management. Marcus felt heat rising in his cheeks, but before he could respond, Chun raised her hand for silence. I understand that this inheritance arrangement may seem unusual, but I can assure you that Ezra Whitfield was completely lucid when he made these decisions. In fact, he specifically anticipated that there might be questions about his reasoning. She turned to another page in the legal document. He asked me to read this additional statement if the inheritance was questioned. To my granddaughters Victoria and Rebecca, who have achieved success in the modern world and need no assistance from me to continue their prosperity, I have provided what I hope will be useful gifts that acknowledge their accomplishments. To my grandson Marcus, who has never forgotten that wealth grows from the ground up and that a man's worth is measured by his willingness to work with his hands, I leave the responsibility for preserving what previous generations built. Not because it will be easy, but because it will require the kind of character that cannot be purchased or inherited, only earned through honest labor and stubborn persistence. The reading of that statement seemed to drain some of the anger from the room, replacing it with an uncomfortable mixture of embarrassment and resentment. Victoria's face had flushed slightly, while Rebecca was staring at her hands as if she'd discovered something fascinating about her nail polish. Daniel Morrison finally spoke up, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone trying to avoid making family tensions worse. Marcus, congratulations. That's quite a responsibility your grandfather has given you. But Jonathan Sterling wasn't ready to let the matter rest. Responsibility is one thing, but practical reality is another. Marcus, no offense, but do you have any idea what it costs to maintain a property that size? Property taxes alone are probably $15,000 a year, and that's before you consider insurance, utilities, repairs, and basic upkeep. Marcus had been thinking about exactly those numbers since Chun had read his grandfather's name, and the mathematics were daunting. His current income from construction work was barely enough to cover his apartment rent and truck payments, let alone the expenses associated with maintaining a rural property that had been neglected for the better part of a decade. "Jonathan's right," Victoria added, her tone shifting from anger to what she probably thought was helpful concern. "Marcus, I don't think you understand what you're getting into. That farmhouse has been sitting empty since grandfather moved to Kova, the assisted living facility, 3 years ago. The roof leaks, the electrical system is probably from the 1940s, and I heard from neighbors that there might be structural problems with the foundation." Rebecca nodded in agreement. "And that's just the house. The barn needs a complete rebuild, the fencing is falling down, and the access road is so bad that delivery trucks won't even attempt it during wet weather. You're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in repairs before the property would be livable, let alone profitable." Marcus looked around the room at his siblings' faces, seeing a mixture of genuine concern and barely concealed condescension. They weren't wrong about the challenges he would face, but their certainty that he couldn't handle those challenges stung more than he wanted to admit. "Maybe," Victoria continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when presenting business proposals to skeptical clients, "the best thing would be to sell the property and divide the proceeds among all of us. That way everyone benefits, and Marcus doesn't get stuck with a financial burden that could bankrupt him." Margaret Chun had been listening to the family discussion with the patient expression of someone who had presided over similar conversations many times before. "I should mention that Ezra included provisions regarding the sale of the property. Marcus has complete discretion to sell if he chooses, but if he decides to keep the property, no other family member can force a sale for a period of 10 years. Additionally, any sale must be approved by Marcus alone." The implication of that statement settled over the room like dust after an explosion. Victoria and Rebecca could argue about the wisdom of Marcus's inheritance, but they had no legal recourse to change their grandfather's decision or force a different outcome. Marcus stood up from his chair, feeling the weight of everyone's attention and expectations pressing down on him like the August humidity outside. "I appreciate everyone's concern," he said quietly, "but I think I need some time to see the property and figure things out for myself before making any decisions." Victoria's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing that her approach had been more confrontational than helpful. "Marcus, we're not trying to gang up on you. We just don't want to see you get in over your head with something that could ruin you financially." "I understand that," Marcus replied, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. "But grandfather left me this property for a reason, and I think I owe it to him and to myself to at least try to understand what that reason was." As the family filed out of Margaret Chun's office into the sweltering Tennessee heat, Marcus could hear his siblings talking quietly among themselves near their cars. He caught fragments of conversation, completely unrealistic, going to be a disaster. Someone should talk sense into him. But he kept walking toward his aging Ford pickup without acknowledging their concerns. The drive from downtown Nashville to Clarksville took 45 minutes through rolling countryside that gradually transitioned from suburban development to genuine rural farmland. Marcus had made this trip hundreds of times during his childhood, but today the familiar route felt different, weighted with new significance and responsibility. As he turned off Highway 41A onto the gravel road that led to his grandfather's property, Marcus could see what his siblings had been talking about. The access road was indeed in terrible condition, rutted by years of weather and neglect, and his truck bounced violently over potholes that had grown large enough to swallow small cars. The farmhouse came into view as he crested a small hill, and even Marcus had to admit that it looked like something from a horror movie about rural decay. The roof sagged visibly in several places, green shutters hung at odd angles like broken wings, and the wraparound porch that had once been his favorite place to sit with his grandfather was now partially collapsed, with support posts leaning at angles that defied architectural logic. Behind the house, the barn was in even worse condition. Its red paint had faded to the color of dried blood, and several sections of the roof had collapsed entirely, leaving gaping holes that provided unwelcome skylights for whatever animals had taken up residence inside. Marcus parked his truck near what had once been a flower garden and sat for a moment, staring at the wreckage of his inheritance. His siblings' voices echoed in his memory, hundreds of thousands in repairs, financial ruin, completely unrealistic expectations. But as he sat there in the gathering dusk, Marcus also heard his grandfather's voice from years past, talking about the importance of understanding what you owned before deciding what it was worth. Ezra Whitfield had been a man who believed that the real value of anything lay not in its appearance, but in its foundation, and that foundation could only be properly assessed by someone willing to get their hands dirty. Marcus climbed out of his truck and walked toward the farmhouse, his boots crunching on gravel that was already being reclaimed by weeds and volunteer grass. The crisis he faced wasn't life or death in the traditional sense, but it was no less real for being financial and emotional. His siblings expected him to fail. His bank account couldn't support the property's needs, and every practical consideration suggested that selling was the only rational choice. But as he stood on the sagging porch and looked out over 127 acres of Tennessee farmland that had sustained his family for 4 generations, Marcus realized that some decisions couldn't be made based on practical considerations alone. Sometimes you had to trust that the people who came before you knew something that couldn't be measured in dollars or assessed by county officials. The question was whether he had the courage to find out what that knowledge might be worth. First contractor Marcus called was Hendricks Construction, a well-established company from Clarksville that specialized in historic property renovation. Their website showcased gleaming before and after photos of antebellum mansions and Victorian estates that had been restored to magazine-worthy perfection, complete with updated electrical systems, modern plumbing, and energy-efficient windows that maintained historical character while meeting contemporary building codes. Dale Hendricks arrived at the farmhouse on a Tuesday morning in September, driving a pristine white pickup truck equipped with laser measuring devices, moisture sensors, and a tablet computer loaded with estimation software that could calculate repair costs down to the penny. He was a third-generation contractor whose grandfather had built half the barns in Montgomery County. But Dale himself had embraced technology with the enthusiasm of someone who believed that digital precision could solve any construction challenge. Marcus met him at the front gate, noting how Hendricks's expression shifted from professional optimism to barely concealed concern as he surveyed the property from the access road. The contractor spent nearly 20 minutes just walking around the exterior of the house, occasionally stopping to photograph sections of damaged siding or rotted window frames with his smartphone. "Mr. Whitfield," Hendricks said after completing his initial assessment, "I'm going to be straight with you because that's how my family has always done business. This structure is what we call a complete teardown situation. The foundation has settled unevenly, which means the entire frame is compromised. Even if we could stabilize the structural elements, you're looking at replacing virtually everything else: roofing, electrical, plumbing, insulation, flooring, windows, and exterior cladding." Marcus had expected bad news, but the clinical precision with which Hendricks delivered his assessment was somehow more discouraging than simple pessimism would have been. "What kind of numbers are we talking about?" Hendricks consulted his tablet, scrolling through screens of calculations that incorporated current material costs, labor rates, and permit requirements. For a complete renovation that would bring this property up to modern building standards, you're looking at a minimum investment of $400,000. And that's assuming we don't encounter any major surprises once we start opening up walls and floors. Given the age of this structure and the extent of neglect, I'd budget closer to $600,000 to be safe. The contractor's moisture sensor had been beeping intermittently throughout their conversation, indicating levels of dampness that suggested extensive mold problems behind the walls. Hendricks showed Marcus the digital readouts, explaining that Remediation would require stripping the interior down to the bare studs and treating every surface with industrial-grade antimicrobial solutions. Now, if you're thinking about this as an investment property, Hendricks continued, you need to understand that the market for rural real estate in this area doesn't support that level of renovation cost. Even after spending $500,000, you'd be lucky to get $300,000 for the property when it's finished. The math just doesn't work unless you're planning to live here yourself for the next 20 years. Marcus thanked Hendricks for his time and honesty, then spent the rest of the morning calling other contractors for second opinions. Morrison Brothers Construction gave him an estimate of $520,000 for complete renovation. Clarksville Home Restoration quoted $475,000, but warned that historical preservation requirements might push costs significantly higher if the county decided to pursue heritage designation for the property. The most discouraging assessment came from Precision Property Solutions, a company that specialized in using advanced imaging technology to evaluate structural integrity. Their representative, a serious young man named Trevor Walsh, arrived with equipment that looked like it belonged in a hospital: thermal imaging cameras, ground-penetrating radar, and ultrasonic thickness gauges that could detect problems invisible to the naked eye. Walsh spent 3 hours conducting his survey, methodically documenting every flaw and weakness with scientific precision. His final report, delivered via email the following day, read like a medical diagnosis for a terminally ill patient. Severe foundation settlement had created stress fractures throughout the load-bearing walls. The electrical system showed evidence of aluminum wiring from the 1960s, a fire hazard that would require complete replacement. The plumbing consisted of a mixture of cast iron and galvanized steel pipes that were corroded beyond repair. Most damaging was Walsh's conclusion that the structural damage was so extensive that renovation would essentially require building a new house around the existing foundation, assuming the foundation itself could be stabilized, which he considered questionable given the apparent shifting in the underlying soil. The real estate professionals Marcus consulted were uniformly pessimistic about the property's potential. Sandra Collins from Clarksville Realty had been selling rural properties for 15 years, and she arrived at the farmhouse with comparable sales data loaded on her tablet and a practiced eye for assessing market value. "Marcus," she said after walking through the house with a penlight and making notes on a digital form, "I've seen a lot of properties in my career, and I have to tell you that this one falls into what we call the tear-down category. The land itself has value minus 127 acres of unrestricted rural property will sell, but you need to think of the structures as a liability rather than an asset." Collins pulled up recent sales data on her tablet, showing Marcus properties throughout Montgomery County that had sold within the past year. A 95-acre farm with a modest but livable house had sold for $850,000. A 140-acre tract with no structures had brought $780,000. The numbers suggested that the farmhouse and outbuildings were actually reducing the property's market value by creating demolition costs for potential buyers. "My recommendation," Collins continued, "would be to list the property as is for $850,000 and let buyers know that the purchase price reflects the cost of clearing the existing structures. You might get lucky and find someone who wants to build their dream home on rural acreage and doesn't mind the cleanup involved." The suggestion that his grandfather's house was worth less than nothing struck Marcus as somehow insulting, though he couldn't argue with Collins's market analysis. She had photographs of similar properties and documentation of actual sale prices, while he had only sentimental attachment to a building that was objectively falling apart. Marcus decided to get one final professional opinion, this time from someone who specialized in historical properties, Dr. Elizabeth Warren from Middle Tennessee State University's Historic Preservation Program had agreed to assess the farmhouse as a potential candidate for restoration grants, or tax incentives available to owners of significant historical structures. Dr. Warren arrived on a crisp October morning, accompanied by a graduate student who documented everything with a high-resolution camera while Warren examined architectural details with the focused attention of an archaeologist studying ancient artifacts. She spent considerable time measuring window proportions, photographing hardware details, and consulting reference books about 19th century construction techniques. The house itself is interesting from a historical perspective, Warren explained as they concluded their survey. It represents a fairly typical example of vernacular farmhouse architecture from the 1850s, with some modifications that were probably made in the early 1900s. The original craftsmanship was quite good. You can see evidence of traditional mortise and tenon joinery in the frame construction. Marcus felt a spark of hope until Warren continued her assessment. However, the level of deterioration and the extent of non-historical modifications made over the years significantly compromise its integrity as a historical resource. The aluminum siding added in the 1970s, the modern windows installed in the 1980s, and the various additions and alterations mean that restoration to historical standards would be extremely expensive and might not qualify for preservation incentives. Warren's graduate student showed Marcus digital photographs of the interior details, pointing out where original features had been covered or removed over the decades. Crown molding had been painted over so many times that its profile was barely visible. Original hardwood floors were hidden beneath layers of linoleum and carpet that had been installed and removed repeatedly. Even the fireplace mantels, which should have been the house's most distinctive features, had been modified with modern gas inserts that destroyed their historical character. "I'm sorry to be the bearer of disappointing news," Warren concluded. "But from a preservation standpoint, this property would require such extensive work to restore historical integrity that it wouldn't be cost-effective compared to other projects competing for limited grant funding." The accumulation of professional opinions created an overwhelming consensus that Marcus's inheritance was, at best, an expensive burden and at worst, a financial disaster waiting to happen. Every expert he consulted had sophisticated tools, extensive experience, and detailed documentation to support their conclusions. The contractors had laser measurements and digital estimates. The real estate agents had comparable market data. The preservation specialist had historical research and photographic evidence. Marcus found himself spending sleepless nights staring at the ceiling of his apartment, calculating and recalculating the mathematics of his situation. His annual income from construction work averaged around $45,000. The property taxes alone would consume nearly a third of his take-home pay, and that was before considering insurance, utilities, or any maintenance costs. Even basic repairs like fixing the worst roof leaks would require money he didn't have. His siblings' concerns, which had initially seemed like condescending interference, began to look like genuine wisdom. Victoria called twice during October to check on his decision-making process, and her tone had shifted from criticism to what sounded like authentic worry about his financial future. "Marcus," she said during their second conversation, "I've been thinking about your situation, and I want you to know that Rebecca and I aren't trying to pressure you into anything. But we've also been watching the real estate market, and rural property values are actually quite strong right now. If you're going to sell, this might be the optimal time." Rebecca had taken a different approach, sending Marcus links to articles about the hidden costs of rural property ownership and the tax implications of inheriting real estate. Her messages were carefully neutral, but the subtext was clear. She was documenting the financial evidence that selling was the only rational choice. Even Margaret Chen, the family attorney, had called to discuss Marcus's options and the legal procedures involved in selling inherited property. She was professionally neutral, but Marcus detected a note of concern in her voice. When she explained the tax consequences of holding on to property that generated expenses without income, the breaking point came in late October when Marcus received a certified letter from Montgomery County informing him that the property had been cited for multiple code violations. A neighbor had apparently complained about the deteriorating structures, and a county inspector had documented unsafe conditions that required immediate attention. The letter gave Marcus 30 days to begin remediation or face daily fines that would accumulate until the violations were corrected. Marcus drove out to the property that evening and sat in his truck staring at the house as darkness fell around him. The county's citations were technical but accurate: loose roofing materials that could blow onto neighboring properties during storms, exposed electrical connections that posed fire hazards, and structural damage that could attract vagrant activity or create safety risks for curious children. The cost of addressing just the immediate code violations would exceed $15,000, money that Marcus didn't have and couldn't borrow against his current income. Meanwhile, the daily fines would accumulate at $200 per day until all violations were corrected, creating a financial obligation that could rapidly spiral beyond any hope of resolution. As he sat there in the growing darkness, Marcus realized that every modern approach to evaluating his inheritance had reached the same conclusion. The sophisticated tools, professional expertise, and market analysis all pointed toward the same inevitable outcome. He needed to sell the property before it destroyed him financially. The contractors with their laser measurements and digital estimates had quantified exactly why renovation was impossible. The real estate professionals with their market data had demonstrated precisely what the property was worth. The preservation specialist with her historical research had explained definitively why restoration wasn't feasible. Even the county government with its regulatory authority had documented legally why the current situation was unsustainable. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Sandra Collins's number. Tomorrow he would call her and authorize listing the property for immediate sale. Tonight he would sit here for a few more minutes and try to understand why his grandfather had thought this inheritance was a gift rather than a burden. The modern world had spoken with unified voice. Some problems couldn't be solved with determination and hard work. Sometimes practical reality had to prevail over sentimental attachment. Sometimes the experts really did know best. But as Marcus prepared to start his truck and drive back to town, something in the darkness beyond his headlights caught his attention. A glint of reflected light from somewhere near the collapsed section of the barn, visible only because of the angle of his headlights and the way shadows fell across the property. It was probably nothing, a piece of broken glass or discarded metal reflecting his truck's lights. But for just a moment, it looked like something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in the comprehensive assessments provided by contractors, real estate agents, and preservation specialists. Something that sophisticated tools and professional expertise might have missed entirely. The knock on Marcus's apartment door came at 7:30 on a expertise might have missed entirely. Thursday morning in early November, soft but persistent enough to pull him from a restless sleep filled with dreams about collapsing roofs and mounting legal bills. He stumbled to the door in his underwear and t-shirt, expecting to find his landlord or perhaps a delivery driver who'd gotten lost in the maze of numbered units that comprised Riverside Gardens apartment complex. Instead, he found himself looking at a small, weathered woman who appeared to be somewhere in her 80s. Wearing a faded floral dress that had probably been stylish during the Carter administration and clutching a worn leather purse against her chest like armor. Her white hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her brown eyes held the kind of sharp intelligence that comes from decades of paying attention to details that other people miss. "You'd be Marcus Whitfield," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the unmistakable accent of someone who'd spent her entire life in rural Tennessee. Ezra's grandson, the one who got the farm. Marcus blinked, still trying to process the unexpected visitor. "Yes, ma'am." I'm sorry, but do we know each other? Name's Dorothy Kellerman. I live in the yellow house about a quarter-mile east of your grandfather's place. Been there for 63 years come December. She studied his face with the careful attention of someone evaluating a horse at auction. Your granddaddy asked me to keep an eye on you once you took over the property. Said you might need some guidance from folks who remember how things used to be done. Marcus invited Dorothy inside, hastily pulling on jeans and offering her coffee, while his mind raced to place her in the geography of his grandfather's neighborhood. He had vague memories of a yellow farmhouse visible from the back pasture, but he'd never paid much attention to who lived there or what their connection to his family might be. Mrs. Kellerman, he began as she settled into his single kitchen chair with the careful precision of someone whose joints protested sudden movements. I appreciate you stopping by, but I should probably mention that I'm planning to sell the property. The repair costs are just too much for me to handle. Dorothy accepted the coffee mug he offered, wrapping her hands around it as if drawing warmth from more than just the liquid inside. That's what Ezra said you'd probably decide. Said the modern world would tell you the place wasn't worth keeping. And you'd listen to them because that's what sensible people do these days. The comment stung more than Marcus wanted to admit, particularly because it seemed to echo the exact conclusion he'd reached after weeks of professional consultations. Mrs. Kellerman, it's not about what anyone told me. I've had contractors, real estate agents, and preservation specialists all evaluate the property. The numbers just don't work. Oh, I'm sure they gave you plenty of numbers, Dorothy replied, sipping her coffee thoughtfully. Folks these days love their numbers. Got computers that can tell you the exact cost of everything and fancy tools that can measure problems down to the inch. But sometimes the most important things can't be measured with modern equipment. Marcus sat down across from her at his small dining table, curious despite his frustration with what sounded like another lecture about the value of hard work and positive thinking. What do you mean? Dorothy set down her coffee mug and reached into her purse, withdrawing a manila envelope that looked like it had been handled frequently over many years. Your grandfather and I were friends for a long time, Marcus. Not romantic friends. I was married to Harold Kellerman for 47 years, until he passed. But the kind of friends that develop between neighbors who help each other through difficult times. She opened the envelope and withdrew several black and white photographs that appeared to have been taken decades earlier. The first showed a much younger Ezra Whitfield standing beside a man Marcus didn't recognize, both wearing work clothes and holding shovels beside what appeared to be an excavation site near the farmhouse. This was taken in 1962, Dorothy explained, pointing to the photograph. That's your granddaddy and my Harold, working on what they told everyone was a new septic system for the house. Took them most of that summer to finish the job, working evenings and weekends when they thought nobody was watching. Marcus studied the photograph, noting that the excavation appeared much larger and more complex than any septic system he'd ever seen. The hole extended deep into the ground, with what looked like concrete forms and reinforcement materials that seemed excessive for waste management purposes. Mrs. Kellerman, are you saying they were building something other than a septic system? Dorothy smiled with the expression of someone who'd been waiting years to share a secret. I'm saying that men who spent 4 years fighting in World War II learned some things about hiding valuable items from people who might want to take them away. And I'm saying that farmers who lived through the Great Depression developed some strong opinions about trusting banks with everything they owned. She showed him another photograph, this one depicting both men lowering what appeared to be a large metal container into the excavation. Even in the grainy black and white image, Marcus could see that the container was substantial, roughly the size of a refrigerator, but constructed from heavy steel and sealed with what looked like industrial-grade gaskets. Your granddaddy never told me exactly what they put down there, Dorothy continued, but I know it took them 3 trips to Nashville in Harold's truck to collect all the materials. And I know they were both acting like men who were preparing for something they hoped would never happen. Marcus felt something cold settling in his stomach as he processed the implications of what Dorothy was showing him. "Mrs. Kellerman, are you suggesting that my grandfather buried something valuable on the property?" "I'm suggesting that your grandfather was a careful man who didn't trust modern institutions to protect the things that mattered most to him. And I'm suggesting that all those experts who've been telling you the property isn't worth keeping might not have been looking in the right places." Dorothy withdrew a third photograph from the envelope, this one showing the completed project, an area near the farmhouse that had been restored to look like undisturbed ground, with no visible evidence of the extensive excavation work depicted. In the earlier images, they were very particular about making sure nobody could tell where they'd been digging, she explained. Used a transit level to make sure the surface was perfectly smooth, then reseeded with grass that matched the surrounding area. Harold was a surveyor before he took up farming, so he knew how to measure things precisely. Marcus studied the photograph, trying to correlate the location with his current knowledge of the property. The area in question appeared to be somewhere between the farmhouse and the collapsed barn, in what was now an overgrown field that he'd barely noticed during his visits with contractors and real estate agents. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "If my grandfather wanted me to know about whatever they buried, why didn't he leave some kind of documentation or instructions?" Dorothy folded her hands in her lap, her expression becoming more serious. "Because Ezra was afraid that if he put anything in writing, it might fall into the wrong hands. He'd seen what happened to other families during the war years, people who had their property seized or their valuables confiscated because they kept records that someone else could find." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts before continuing. "But he also knew that Dorothy Kellerman had the best memory in Montgomery County and that I'd never forgotten a promise I made to a friend. He asked me to wait until you'd had time to hear what the modern world had to say about the property, then decide for yourself whether you wanted to listen to someone who remembered how things used to be done." Marcus found himself staring at the photographs, his mind racing through the implications of Dorothy's revelation. If his grandfather had indeed buried something valuable on the property, it would change every calculation he'd made about keeping or selling the farm. But it would also mean that he'd need to locate and excavate whatever had been hidden, a process that could be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially fruitless if Dorothy's memories were inaccurate or if the burial site had been disturbed. "Over the past 60 years, Mrs. Kellerman," he said carefully, "even if what you're saying is true, I don't have the resources to start digging up the property on the basis of 60-year-old photographs. The county has already cited the property for code violations, and I'm facing daily fines if I don't address the immediate safety issues." Dorothy nodded with the understanding expression of someone who'd anticipated that objection. "That's where Harold's surveying skills come in handy. Before he died, he made me a detailed map showing exactly where they buried everything. Not approximate locations, precise measurements from fixed reference points that are still visible today." She reached into her purse again and withdrew a folded piece of paper that had been carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. When she unfolded it, Marcus saw a hand-drawn diagram that showed the farmhouse, barn, and surrounding landscape with mathematical precision. Lines extended from corner markers on the buildings to specific points in the field, with distances marked in feet and inches and compass bearings noted for each measurement. Harold was trained by the Army Corps of Engineers during the war, Dorothy explained. He knew how to create maps that would be accurate decades later, even if the landscape changed. These measurements are referenced to the stone foundation corners of the farmhouse, which haven't moved since the building was constructed. Marcus studied the map, noting the careful attention to detail and the multiple reference points that would allow someone to triangulate the exact location of whatever had been buried. The precision of the surveying work suggested that Harold Kellerman had approached the project with professional competence, not the casual guesswork of amateur treasure hunters. "Mrs. Kellerman, what exactly do you think they buried out there?" Dorothy's expression became thoughtful, as if she was weighing how much information to share. "I know that both men had concerns about the stability of banks and the government's tendency to confiscate private property during emergencies. This was during the Cold War, when people worried about all sorts of catastrophic possibilities." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I also know that your grandfather had been collecting certain items for many years, things that held their value regardless of what happened to paper money or government institutions. Harold helped him with the research and acquisition, since he had contacts from his military service who knew about such matters." The vague nature of Dorothy's explanation was simultaneously frustrating and intriguing. Marcus could sense that she knew more than she was revealing, but he also understood that she might have legitimate reasons for being cautious about sharing details with someone she'd only just met. "Mrs. Kellerman, I appreciate you bringing me this information, but I need to be realistic about my situation. Even if there is something buried on the property, locating and recovering it would require time, money, and equipment that I don't have. Meanwhile, I'm facing immediate financial pressures that won't wait for a treasure hunt." Dorothy finished her coffee and carefully returned the photographs and map to her envelope. "Marcus, I understand that you're in a difficult position, but I also think you should consider that your grandfather was a very smart man who understood the difference between apparent value and real value." She stood up from the kitchen chair with the slow deliberation of someone whose body reminded her daily that youth was a temporary condition. "All those experts who've been telling you the property isn't worth keeping, they're measuring the wrong things. They're looking at the cost of fixing what's broken instead of the value of what's already there." Marcus walked her to the door, his mind churning with questions and possibilities that he wasn't sure he wanted to pursue. "Mrs. Kellerman, if I decided to investigate what you've told me, would you be willing to help me interpret Harold's map?" Dorothy turned back to face him, her brown eyes bright with something that might have been hope or determination. "Marcus, I'm 83 years old, and I've been keeping this secret for over 60 years. If you're ready to find out what your grandfather really left you, I'll do whatever I can to help." After Dorothy left, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, staring at the business cards he'd collected from contractors, real estate agents, and preservation specialists. Each card represented hours of professional consultation and detailed analysis that had led to the same conclusion. His inheritance was a financial liability that would destroy him if he tried to keep it. But Dorothy Kellerman represented something entirely different, a connection to knowledge that couldn't be measured with laser devices or calculated by computer software. She embodied the kind of institutional memory that modern experts dismissed as unreliable anecdote, but which sometimes contained information that sophisticated analysis missed entirely. Marcus realized that he was facing the same choice that had confronted every generation before him, whether to trust the conventional wisdom of his era or to bet everything on knowledge that couldn't be verified until it was tested. The modern world offered him certainty, documentation, and professional expertise. Dorothy Kellerman offered him mystery, possibility, and the promise that some secrets could only be revealed to people willing to dig deeper than surface appearances suggested. The question was whether he had the courage to ignore everything the experts had told him and trust his future to the memories of an elderly woman who claimed to know where treasure was buried. Outside his apartment window, November rain was beginning to fall, the same rain that would be turning the access road to his grandfather's property into an impassable muddy mess. The same rain that would be finding new ways through the damaged roof of the farmhouse and accelerating the decay that every professional consultant had documented with scientific precision. But somewhere beneath that deteriorating property, if Dorothy Kellerman was right, lay something that might change everything he thought he knew about the inheritance his grandfather had left him. something that 60 years of weather and neglect couldn't touch, waiting patiently for someone willing to look beyond what modern analysis could measure. Marcus picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Sandra Collins's number. He could call her right now and authorize the property listing that would solve all his immediate problems. Or he could drive out to Dorothy Kellerman's yellow farmhouse and ask an 83-year-old woman to show him how to read a map that might lead to buried treasure or might lead to nothing more than empty holes in the ground. The choice would determine not just his financial future, but whether he was the kind of man who trusted expert analysis or the kind who was willing to bet everything on the possibility that some knowledge couldn't be captured in professional reports. The rain continued falling, and Marcus continued staring at his phone, knowing that whatever decision he made in the next few minutes would change the trajectory of his entire life. The certified letter from Montgomery County arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, delivered by a postal worker who required Marcus's signature and seemed apologetic about the official nature of the correspondence. The envelope bore the seal of the county government and was marked with red lettering that indicated urgent legal notice, the kind of official communication that immediately elevated Marcus's heart rate even before he opened it. Inside, County Code Enforcement Officer Jennifer Walsh had documented a comprehensive list of violations that had expanded significantly since the initial citation in October. The original concerns about loose roofing materials and exposed electrical connections had been joined by new issues. Structural collapse in the barn posed immediate safety hazards to neighboring properties. Standing water from recent rains had created mosquito breeding conditions that violated public health ordinances, and overgrown vegetation was providing harbor for rodent populations that could spread disease. More critically, the letter informed Marcus that the property had been classified as a public nuisance under Tennessee Code Section 1321101, which gave Montgomery County the authority to begin abatement procedures if the owner failed to address violations within 15 days of notification. Abatement procedures, the letter explained in clinical legal language, included the county's right to hire contractors to perform necessary remediation work and then place a lien against the property for all costs incurred, plus administrative fees and legal expenses. Marcus read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new implications that made his financial situation more desperate. The county's cost estimates for professional abatement ranged from $85,000 to $120,000, depending on the extent of work required. Those costs would become a legal obligation secured by the property itself, meaning that even if he sold the farm, the county's lien would be satisfied before he received any proceeds from the sale. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. Sandra Collins had estimated the property's market value at $850,000 in its current condition. Subtract the county's abatement costs, real estate commissions, legal fees, and capital gains taxes on the inheritance, and Marcus would be left with perhaps $600,000, a substantial sum, but not enough to justify the stress and uncertainty of fighting a legal battle with county government. The letter also contained a timeline that compressed his decision-making window to virtually nothing. If he chose to address the violations himself, he needed to submit a detailed remediation plan within 5 business days and begin work within 10 days of approval. If he chose to contest the violations, he could request a hearing before the County Board of Zoning Appeals, but work would need to continue during the appeals process to prevent additional penalties. Marcus drove to the property that afternoon, ostensibly to document the violations for his own records, but actually to sit in his truck and try to process the reality that his inheritance had transformed from a potential burden into an immediate crisis. The November weather had been particularly harsh, with alternating periods of freezing rain and warm temperatures that had accelerated the deterioration of already compromised structures. The barn's collapse had indeed worsened since his last visit, with an entire section of roof having fallen in and created what looked like a giant's mouth filled with broken teeth of splintered lumber. Standing water had accumulated in low areas where drainage had been blocked by debris, and the stagnant pools reflected the gray sky like mirrors in an abandoned landscape. More troubling was evidence that the property had attracted unwanted attention during his absence. Tire tracks in the muddy access road indicated that vehicles had been coming and going, and he discovered several areas near the farmhouse where someone had been digging shallow holes, apparently searching for something valuable enough to justify trespassing on private property. The sight of those unauthorized excavations sent a chill through Marcus that had nothing to do with the November cold. If word had somehow spread about potential buried treasure on the property, he was facing complications far beyond county code violations. Treasure hunters, metal detector enthusiasts, and simple thieves could turn his already difficult situation into a nightmare of security, concerns, and legal liability. Marcus pulled out his phone and called Dorothy Kellerman, reaching her on the second ring. Her voice sounded older than it had during their morning visit to his apartment, perhaps reflecting the physical toll of an elderly woman maintaining a rural household during increasingly difficult weather. "Mrs. Kellerman, this is Marcus Whitfield. I need to ask you something important. Have you mentioned our conversation to anyone else? About what my grandfather and your husband buried on the property?" Dorothy's pause was long enough to confirm Marcus's fears before she spoke. "Marcus, I'm afraid I might have made a mistake. My neighbor's boy, Danny Morrison, was helping me with some yard work last week, and he overheard me talking to my sister about your situation. Danny's a good kid, but he's also got a big mouth and too much time on his hands since he got laid off from the auto parts store." Marcus felt his stomach tightening as he processed the implications. "Mrs. Kellerman, someone's been digging on the property. Multiple locations. Looks like they were using metal detectors or following some kind of systematic search pattern." "Oh Lord," Dorothy's voice carried genuine distress. "Marcus, if Danny told his friends about what he heard, this could get out of hand very quickly. There's a whole network of people around here who consider themselves treasure hunters, and they don't always worry too much about property rights when they think there's something valuable to be found." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching on the access road. Marcus looked in his rearview mirror and saw two pickup trucks making their way carefully over the rutted surface, followed by what appeared to be a Montgomery County Sheriff's Department patrol car. The convoy suggested official business rather than casual visitors, and Marcus felt his anxiety level spike as he watched the vehicles parked near his truck. County Code Enforcement Officer Jennifer Walsh emerged from the lead truck, accompanied by two men Marcus didn't recognize. The sheriff's deputy remained in his patrol car, but positioned it to block the access road, effectively preventing anyone from leaving the property without official permission. The staging suggested that this was more than a routine inspection visit. "Mr. Whitfield," Walsh called out as she approached his truck, "I'm glad we found you here. We need to discuss the status of your remediation plan and some additional concerns that have come to our attention." Marcus climbed out of his truck to meet the group, noting that both of Walsh's companions were carrying official-looking clipboards and wore the kind of utility vests that suggested they were contractors or inspectors, rather than county employees. Their presence implied that the county was already moving toward the abatement process, preparing cost estimates for work they expected to perform whether Marcus approved or not. "Ms. Walsh," Marcus said, trying to project more confidence than he felt, "I received your letter this morning. I understand that I have 15 days to respond with a remediation plan." Walsh consulted her clipboard, flipping through several pages of documentation that appeared to be far more extensive than the original violation notice. "Mr. Whitfield, the timeline has been accelerated due to additional factors that have come to our attention. We've received reports of unauthorized activity on your property, including evidence of excavation work that may violate archaeological protection statutes. She gestured toward the shallow holes that Marcus had discovered, and he realized that the county's interest in his property had evolved beyond simple code enforcement. Additionally, we've been contacted by the Tennessee Historical Commission regarding potential historical significance of this property. Any excavation or earth-moving activity now requires archaeological clearance before work can proceed. Marcus felt the situation spinning beyond his control as new layers of bureaucratic complexity were added to an already impossible timeline. Ms. Walsh, I haven't authorized any excavation work. Those holes were dug by trespassers, probably treasure hunters who heard rumors about the property. One of Walsh's companions, a heavy-set man with a beard who'd been taking photographs of the unauthorized digging, looked up from his camera. Mr. Whitfield, I'm Dr. Robert Hayes from the State Archaeological Survey. Regardless of who did the digging, any disturbance of potentially significant historical sites triggers our review process. We'll need to conduct a complete survey before any remediation work can begin. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. An archaeological survey could take months to complete, during which time the county's daily fines would continue accumulating and the property's condition would continue deteriorating. Meanwhile, he would be legally prohibited from addressing the code violations that had triggered the crisis in the first place. Dr. Hayes, Marcus said, struggling to keep his voice level, how long does an archaeological survey typically take? Hayes consulted his own clipboard, reviewing what appeared to be a standard checklist for historical site evaluation. For a property of this size and potential significance, we're looking at a minimum of 6 weeks for preliminary assessment, assuming favorable weather conditions. If we discover artifacts or structural remains that require detailed analysis, the process could extend to several months. Marcus felt the walls closing in around him as each new development made his situation more impossible. The county wanted immediate action to address code violations, but the state wanted extended delays to evaluate historical significance. Meanwhile, treasure hunters were trespassing on his property based on rumors that could attract even more unwanted attention, and his financial resources were completely inadequate to navigate the legal and bureaucratic maze that was developing around his inheritance. The sheriff's deputy finally emerged from his patrol car and approached the group, his expression suggesting someone who'd presided over similar property disputes before. Mr. Whitfield, I'm Deputy Carlson. We've had 3 reports of suspicious activity on this property in the past week. Neighbors are concerned about increased traffic and people with metal detectors working at night without permission. Deputy Carlson opened a small notebook and consulted his notes from the recent incidents. Last Tuesday, Mrs. Henderson reported seeing flashlights moving around your barn area around midnight. Thursday night, someone driving a red pickup truck got stuck in your access road and had to be pulled out by a tow truck at 2 in the morning. Saturday afternoon, a neighbor complained about 6 people with metal detectors working systematically across your back pasture. The deputy's documentation painted a picture of Marcus's property becoming a magnet for treasure hunters, who were treating it as public land available for their recreational prospecting. The situation was clearly escalating beyond casual trespassing into organized treasure hunting activity that could attract even more participants if word continued to spread. Marcus realized that his window for making a private decision about Dorothy Kellerman's information was rapidly closing. If he didn't act soon to investigate what his grandfather had buried, the opportunity might be lost entirely to a combination of official oversight, bureaucratic delays, and unauthorized treasure hunters who had no legal right to be on the property, but might discover valuable items before he could locate them himself. Deputy Carlson, Marcus asked, what authority do I have to prevent trespassing on private property? The deputy's expression suggested that he'd answered this question many times before for frustrated property owners. You have the right to Post no trespassing signs and to file complaints against individuals you catch on your property without permission. However, prosecuting trespassers requires evidence that they were warned away and chose to ignore the warning. Unless you catch someone in the act and can prove they were aware they were trespassing, it's difficult to pursue criminal charges. The practical reality was that Marcus lacked the resources to maintain security on 127 acres of rural property, especially while dealing with county code enforcement, state archaeological oversight, and his own financial limitations. Every day he delayed making a decision about Dorothy's information was another day that unauthorized treasure hunters could be searching for the same buried items that might represent his only hope of keeping the property. As the various officials concluded their inspection and prepared to leave, Marcus found himself facing the most important decision of his adult life. He could continue following conventional wisdom, accept that his inheritance was a financial liability, and sell the property to escape the mounting legal and bureaucratic pressures. Or he could trust Dorothy Kellerman's 60-year-old memories and bet everything on the possibility that his grandfather had hidden something valuable enough to change the entire equation. The modern world, represented by county code enforcement, state archaeological oversight, and law enforcement concerns, was offering him complexity, delays, and mounting costs that would eventually force him to surrender the property, regardless of his personal preferences. Dorothy Kellerman was offering him uncertainty, risk, and the chance that unconventional knowledge might prove more valuable than professional expertise. Standing in the gathering dusk beside his grandfather's deteriorating farmhouse, surrounded by evidence of bureaucratic entanglements and unauthorized treasure hunting, Marcus realized that his time for careful deliberation had expired. The crisis was no longer whether he could afford to keep the property, but whether he could afford to walk away without investigating the one possibility that might justify his grandfather's faith in him. Tomorrow, he would drive to Dorothy Kellerman's yellow farmhouse and ask an 83-year-old woman to help him read a 60-year-old surveying map. Not because he was confident it would lead to treasure, but because he was finally desperate enough to trust knowledge that couldn't be verified by modern experts or documented by professional consultants. The choice was no longer between safety and risk. It was between certain failure and the possibility of discovering that some secrets were worth more than all the sophisticated analysis that money could buy. The drive to Dorothy Kellerman's yellow farmhouse took Marcus through countryside that had changed dramatically since his childhood visits to his grandfather's property. Subdivisions with names like Heritage Meadows and Country Manor Estates had sprouted between the original farms, their vinyl-sided houses and perfect lawns creating an odd patchwork of rural nostalgia and suburban convenience that satisfied neither aesthetic completely. Dorothy's house, however, remained unchanged from Marcus's memories, a modest, two-story structure with white trim and a wraparound porch that suggested practical comfort rather than architectural ambition. The yellow paint was faded but well-maintained, and the yard showed evidence of someone who still believed in keeping a proper garden despite advancing age and physical limitations. Marcus parked beside a mailbox that read H&D Kellerman in faded lettering, noting that Dorothy had never changed the nameplate even though Harold had been dead for over a decade. The gesture suggested the kind of loyalty to memory that Marcus hoped might extend to promises made to deceased friends about buried secrets and inherited responsibilities. Dorothy answered his knock before he'd finished raising his hand to try again, as if she'd been watching for his arrival from behind the lace curtains that covered her front windows. She wore a different floral dress from their previous meeting, but it was equally practical and similarly dated, giving her the timeless appearance of women who'd learned to make clothing last through multiple decades of changing fashion. "Marcus," she said simply, stepping aside to invite him into a living room that looked like a museum exhibit of rural American life from the 1970s. The furniture was solid and functional, arranged around a brick fireplace that clearly served as the room's focal point during winter months. Photographs covered every available surface: wedding pictures, military portraits, children and grandchildren, captured at various stages of growth and achievement. "Mrs. Kellerman," Marcus began, then stopped as he realized he wasn't sure how to articulate what he'd come to ask. The conventional part of his mind kept insisting that he was about to make a catastrophic mistake based on the unverifiable memories of an elderly woman who might be confused about events from 60 years ago. "You've decided to look for what Ezra and Harold buried," Dorothy said, settling into a recliner that had clearly been her preferred seat for many years. "But you're scared that I might be wrong, or that you might not be smart enough to find it, or that you might waste time and money you don't have on something that doesn't exist." The accuracy of her assessment was unsettling, but also somehow reassuring. If Dorothy could read his emotional state so precisely, perhaps her memories about other matters were equally reliable. "Mrs. Kellerman, I have to be honest with you. I don't know anything about excavation or treasure hunting. I've never used surveying equipment or underground detection devices. Even if your husband's map is accurate, I might not have the skills to locate what they buried." Dorothy reached for a wooden box that sat on the table beside her chair, withdrawing a pair of reading glasses that she settled carefully on her nose before looking at Marcus with renewed focus. "Marcus, can I tell you something about your grandfather? That might help you understand why he chose you for this inheritance." Marcus nodded, though he suspected he was about to hear another story about the value of hard work and traditional virtues that wouldn't address his practical concerns about equipment, expertise, and time constraints. Ezra never finished high school, Dorothy began, her voice taking on the cadence of someone settling into a familiar narrative. "Had to quit in 10th grade when his father died, and someone needed to run the farm to support his mother and younger siblings. But that man could figure out how to fix anything mechanical that was ever made, and he could solve problems that stumped people with college engineering degrees." She gestured toward one of the photographs on her mantel, showing a younger Ezra, standing beside a complicated piece of farm machinery that Marcus didn't recognize. During the drought of 1956, when most farmers in the county were losing their crops because the irrigation systems couldn't pull water from the dropping water table, Ezra designed and built a pump system that could reach deeper wells and deliver more water with less power than anything the agricultural extension agents were recommending. Marcus studied the photograph, noting his grandfather's expression of quiet satisfaction rather than pride. It was the face of someone who'd solved a practical problem through determination and common sense, rather than formal training or expensive equipment. "The point," Dorothy continued, "is that Ezra chose you not because you're an expert at treasure hunting, but because you're the kind of person who doesn't give up when problems get complicated. He watched you work on mechanical projects when you were a boy, and he saw that you had the same approach he did. Keep trying different solutions until you find one that works." The flattering assessment made Marcus uncomfortable because it seemed to place expectations on him that he wasn't sure he could meet. "Mrs. Kellerman, that was different. Those were simple repair jobs, not major excavation projects with legal and financial consequences." Dorothy removed her reading glasses and fixed him with the direct gaze of someone who'd spent 8 decades learning to distinguish between legitimate concerns and convenient excuses. "Marcus, what's the worst thing that could happen if you try to find what they buried and fail?" The question forced Marcus to confront fears he hadn't fully articulated, even to himself. "I could waste the little time and money I have left. I could make the county's violations worse by doing unauthorized excavation. I could attract more treasure hunters and create security problems. I could destroy any chance of selling the property for enough money to pay off the liens and penalties. And what's the worst thing that happens if you don't try?" Marcus felt something shift in his thinking as he considered the alternative scenario. "I lose the property anyway. The county forces The sale to pay for abatement costs. My siblings get to say they were right about me not being able to handle responsibility. And I never find out what my grandfather thought was important enough to hide for 60 years. Dorothy smiled with the expression of a teacher whose student had finally arrived at the correct answer through their own reasoning. So you're choosing between two kinds of failure: failure after trying something that might work, or failure after not trying anything at all. Dorothy climbed carefully from the truck and surveyed the landscape with the focused attention of someone trying to correlate current reality with 60-year-old memories. The barn's continued collapse had altered the sight lines she remembered, and decades of vegetation growth had changed the appearance of reference points that Harold had used for his surveying measurements. "It's different than I expected," she admitted, opening Harold's leather notebook to the page containing the burial site map. "The big oak tree near the barn is gone. Probably came down in that ice storm we had about 10 years ago. And there's a lot more brush and undergrowth than there was when Harold and Ezra did the original work." Marcus studied the hand-drawn map, noting the careful attention to geometric relationships between fixed reference points. Harold had used the stone foundation corners of the farmhouse as his primary survey markers, with secondary measurements taken from the barn's foundation and a large boulder that was still visible near the property's eastern boundary, Mrs. Kellerman. "Even if some of the reference points have changed, the foundation corner should still be accurate. Stone doesn't move unless something major disturbs it." Dorothy nodded, though her expression suggested lingering uncertainty about their ability to interpret Harold's measurements correctly. "The tricky part is accounting for magnetic declination changes over 60 years. Harold was very specific about using true north rather than magnetic north for his compass bearings, but the difference between the two has shifted since 1962. Marcus had never heard the term magnetic declination, but Harold's notebook included several pages of explanation about the phenomenon. Apparently, magnetic north and true north differed by several degrees in their geographic area, and that difference changed gradually over time as the Earth's magnetic field shifted. Harold had calculated the correction factors necessary to translate his 1962 compass readings into bearings that would be accurate in future decades, using Harold's brass compass and following his step-by-step instructions. Marcus and Dorothy spent the first hour establishing their baseline measurements from the farmhouse foundation corners. The process was more complex than Marcus had anticipated, requiring careful attention to slopes, obstacles, and measurement techniques that Harold had developed through professional surveying experience. 68 feet, 4 inches from the southwest foundation corner. Dorothy read from the notebook as Marcus held one end of a measuring tape at the stone marker Harold had specified. "Bearing of 47 degrees true north, corrected for 1962 magnetic declination." Marcus walked the measured distance and bearing, using the brass compass to maintain direction, while Dorothy called out corrections from Harold's detailed instructions. The process felt both precise and primitive, more accurate than casual estimation, but far less sophisticated than the laser measuring devices and GPS systems that modern contractors routinely used. When they reached the location indicated by Harold's calculations, Marcus was disappointed to find nothing more than an area of seemingly ordinary pasture, covered with dormant grass and scattered with the kind of debris that accumulated on any rural property over decades of neglect. No visible markers indicated that anything had been buried there, and the ground showed no obvious signs of previous excavation. Dorothy consulted the notebook again, checking Harold's instructions for verifying the correct location. "He says to look for a triangular pattern of stones placed about 18 inches apart, just under the surface." They were his markers to help locate the exact center of the burial site. Marcus began probing the area with a metal rod, pushing it into the cota soil to detect buried objects that might be Harold's stone markers. The ground was softer than he'd expected, probably due to recent rains, but after several minutes of systematic searching, He felt the rod strike something solid about 6 inches below the surface. Careful excavation with a hand trowel revealed a flat piece of fieldstone that had clearly been placed deliberately rather than deposited naturally. 2 more stones emerged as Marcus expanded his search, forming the triangular pattern that Harold had described in his notes. "This is it," Dorothy said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and relief. "Harold's markers are exactly where he said they'd be." Marcus felt a surge of confidence as he realized that Harold's surveying had been accurate enough to locate specific markers after 6 decades of weather and ground settling. If the surface indicators were correct, the buried container should be directly beneath their current location. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. They began digging in earnest, taking turns with the shovels and removing soil in careful layers to avoid missing anything important or damaging whatever might be buried. Below, the work was harder than Marcus had anticipated. The clay soil became increasingly dense as they went deeper, and they had to stop frequently to remove rocks and roots that interfered with their progress. After 2 hours of digging, they'd created a hole roughly 4 feet square and 3 feet deep. But they'd found nothing except more clay soil and the occasional fragment of broken pottery or rusted metal that suggested previous human activity on the site. Harold's notes say the container should be 42 inches below the original surface level, Dorothy said, consulting the notebook again. But we don't know how much the ground level might have changed since 1962 due to erosion or soil deposition. Marcus was beginning to worry that they were digging in the wrong location when his shovel struck something that felt different from soil or stone. The metallic sound was subtle but distinct, suggesting manufactured material rather than natural debris. Careful excavation around the contact point revealed the edge of what appeared to be a large metal container, exactly as Harold's photographs had depicted. The container was larger than Marcus had expected, roughly the size of a footlocker, and appeared to be constructed from heavy steel with sealed joints that had protected it from decades of moisture and corrosion. "Dorothy," Marcus called out, his voice tight with excitement, "I think we found it." As they worked to expose more of the container, Marcus became aware of vehicle sounds from the access road. A pickup truck was approaching the property, moving slowly over the rutted surface in the careful manner that suggested either official business or deliberate reconnaissance. Dorothy heard the engine noise as well and immediately moved to position herself between the excavation site and the approaching vehicle. "Marcus, we need to cover this hole. If that's county officials or treasure hunters, we don't want them to see what we're doing." Marcus quickly spread one of their tarps over the excavation, weighting down the edges with soil and debris to make it look like they were simply storing materials rather than actively digging. Dorothy gathered the hand tools and moved them away from the immediate area, while Marcus tried to assume a casual posture that suggested routine property maintenance rather than treasure hunting. The approaching truck belonged to someone Marcus didn't recognize, a middle-aged man wearing camouflage clothing and carrying what appeared to be a sophisticated metal detector. His passenger was younger, probably in his 20s, and was studying the property with the focused attention of someone conducting surveillance rather than casual sightseeing. "Morning," the driver called out as he parked near Marcus's truck. "I'm Eddie Morrison, Dorothy's neighbor's cousin. This is my son Jake. We heard there might be some interesting historical artifacts on this property, and we wondered if you'd mind us doing a little metal detecting on the back pasture." Marcus recognized the name Morrison from Dorothy's earlier story about the neighbor's boy who'd overheard their conversation, and he realized that word about potential treasure had spread further than either of them had anticipated. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your interest, but this is private property and I'm not allowing any metal detecting or excavation activities. The county has already cited the property for various violations, and I can't risk additional complications from unauthorized digging. Jake Morrison spoke up from the passenger seat, his tone suggesting someone who'd done considerable research about treasure hunting rights and property law. Actually, Mr. Whitfield, Tennessee statute allows for the recovery of abandoned property by finder if the landowner hasn't actively searched for it within a reasonable time period. Since this property has been vacant for several years, there might be legal grounds for claiming anything we find. The citation of specific legal statutes suggested that the Morrisons had done more than casual research about treasure hunting on Marcus's property. They'd apparently consulted attorneys or legal references about their rights to search for and claim valuable items. Regardless of his ownership of the land itself, Marcus felt his anger building as he realized that his grandfather's secret had become the subject of legal maneuvering by people who had no connection to the family or knowledge of what had actually been buried. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the property. If you have legal questions about treasure hunting rights, you can discuss them with my attorney. Eddie Morrison's expression shifted from friendly neighbor to determined treasure hunter. Mr. Whitfield, we're not trying to cause problems, but there's a lot of talk around the county about valuable items buried on this property. If you're not actively searching for them, then maybe other people should have the opportunity. Dorothy stepped forward with the authoritative presence of someone who'd spent 8 decades dealing with neighbors who overstepped boundaries. Eddie Morrison, you get yourself off this property right now before I call your grandmother and tell her what you're up to. This land belongs to Marcus Whitfield, and you have no right to be here without his permission. The mention of his grandmother apparently struck home because Eddie's aggressive posture deflated somewhat. But Jake Morrison was less impressed by Dorothy's authority and continued studying the property with obvious interest in areas where previous treasure hunting had occurred. We'll go for now, Eddie finally said, but this isn't over. If there's really something valuable buried here, the whole county's going to know about it soon. You might want to consider partnership arrangements with people who have proper equipment and legal knowledge. As the Morrisons drove away, Marcus realized that their excavation was operating under time pressure that went beyond county code enforcement and archaeological oversight. If treasure hunting fever continued spreading through the local community, they could face organized searches by people with sophisticated equipment and questionable respect for property rights. Dorothy, Marcus said as they pulled the tarp away from their partially exposed container, how many people do you think know about what your husband and my grandfather buried? Dorothy's expression was grim as she considered the implications of the Morrisons' visit. Too many, and the number's going to keep growing. Once people start talking about buried treasure, it becomes the kind of story that spreads faster than good sense or legal considerations. They returned to their excavation with renewed urgency, working to expose enough of the container to determine whether it could be moved intact or would need to be opened on site. The metallic surface that emerged from the clay soil was exactly as Harold's photograph had depicted. A heavy steel container with sealed joints and industrial-grade construction that had protected its contents for 60 years. As they worked to clear soil from around the container's edges, Marcus realized that Harold and Ezra's old-school methods had succeeded where modern expertise had failed. No sophisticated ground-penetrating radar or computer analysis had been needed to locate their burial site, just careful surveying, detailed notes, and the patience to follow instructions that had been written by men who understood the difference between hiding something temporarily and preserving it permanently. The container itself was proof that some knowledge couldn't be captured by contemporary technology or professional consultation. It had been placed by people who'd learned engineering principles through practical application rather than academic study, and it had been located using techniques that predated digital precision but achieved equivalent results through careful craftsmanship. The question now was whether Marcus could complete the recovery before county officials, state archaeologists, or local treasure hunters interfered with work that belonged to him by right of inheritance and family history. The old ways had proven their worth, but the modern world was closing in fast. The steel container proved far heavier than Marcus had anticipated when they finally exposed its full dimensions. What Harold's photographs had made appear to be a manageable footlocker was actually a custom-built vault measuring roughly 3 feet by 2 feet by 18 inches deep, constructed from quarter-inch steel plate with reinforced corners and a locking mechanism that looked like it belonged on a bank safe. Marcus and Dorothy spent another hour carefully excavating around the container's perimeter, removing clay soil that had settled and hardened around the metal surface over 6 decades of burial. The weight became apparent when Marcus tried to shift the container even slightly. It remained completely immovable despite his best efforts to create leverage with the pry bar. Harold's notes mention that the container weighs approximately 400 pounds when loaded, Dorothy said, consulting the leather notebook again. He calculated that they'd need block and tackle equipment to lift it out of the excavation, or they'd have to open it underground and remove the contents, piece by piece. Marcus studied the container's locking mechanism, noting the heavy-duty construction that suggested Harold and Ezra had invested considerable money in protecting their buried assets. The lock itself was a combination design with multiple dials, and the steel around it showed no signs of corrosion or mechanical damage despite decades of underground storage. "Mrs. Kellerman, do you know the combination to this lock?" Dorothy's expression became thoughtful as she considered the question. "Harold told me that they used a number sequence that Ezra would remember without having to write it down. Something personal that couldn't be forgotten, but wouldn't be obvious to anyone else who might discover the container." She paused, looking at the locking mechanism with the focused attention of someone trying to recall specific details from years past. "I think it was related to dates that were important to your grandfather, maybe his military service numbers or significant family anniversaries." Harold said they chose something that would be meaningful to Ezra but meaningless to strangers. Marcus felt frustrated by the additional complication, though he had to admire his grandfather's thoroughness in protecting the buried assets. Even if someone managed to locate and excavate the container, they'd still need specific knowledge about Ezra's personal history to access whatever was stored inside. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted his thoughts about possible combination sequences. This time, multiple engines were approaching from the access road, suggesting a more serious incursion than the Morrisons' reconnaissance visit earlier that morning. Marcus and Dorothy quickly repositioned the tarps to conceal their excavation, but the size and depth of the hole made complete concealment impossible. Anyone who looked closely would realize that systematic digging had been taking place. Regardless of their efforts to camouflage the site, 3 pickup trucks appeared over the rise, followed by what looked like a county vehicle with official markings. The convoy suggested coordinated activity rather than casual treasure hunting, and Marcus felt his anxiety spike as he recognized one of the trucks as belonging to Eddie Morrison. County Code Enforcement Officer Jennifer Walsh emerged from the official vehicle, accompanied by the same archaeologist Dr. Robert Hayes, who'd visited the property during the previous week. But this time they were joined by additional officials, whose presence suggested that Marcus's situation had escalated beyond routine code enforcement. "Mr. Whitfield," Walsh called out as she approached with her clipboard and digital camera, "we've received multiple reports of unauthorized excavation activities on this property. You were specifically informed that any earth-moving work requires archaeological clearance and county permits." Marcus felt trapped between the need to protect his excavation and the legal requirement to cooperate with county officials. "Ms. Walsh, I'm conducting basic property maintenance and investigating drainage issues that might be contributing to the standing water problems you cited in your violation notice." Dr. Hayes was already photographing the tarps and disturbed soil around the excavation site, documenting evidence that would become part of his archaeological assessment. "Mr. Whitfield, This appears to be systematic excavation rather than routine maintenance. The soil displacement patterns and the depth of digging suggest that you're searching for specific buried objects. Eddie Morrison had brought reinforcements, 3 men Marcus didn't recognize, all carrying metal detectors and wearing the kind of utility vests that suggested serious treasure hunting equipment. They were positioning themselves around the property perimeter, clearly intending to begin their own search regardless of official oversight or property rights. "Ms. Walsh," Marcus said, trying to maintain composure while his grandfather's secret lay exposed just beneath the concealing tarps. "I need to understand what authority these other individuals have to be on my private property during an official inspection." Walsh consulted her clipboard, flipping through several pages of documentation that had apparently expanded significantly since their previous encounter. "Mr. Whitfield, when potential archaeological significance is suspected, Tennessee law allows for the participation of qualified researchers and local historical societies in site evaluation. Mr. Morrison claims that his group represents legitimate historical research interests." The bureaucratic language was clearly designed to provide legal cover for treasure hunting activities that would otherwise constitute trespassing. Marcus realized that his property had become the subject of legal maneuvering that extended far beyond his own rights as the landowner. Jake Morrison stepped forward with a folder containing what appeared to be legal documentation. "Mr. Whitfield, we've researched the historical significance of this property, and we believe it may contain artifacts related to Civil War activity in Montgomery County. Tennessee Statute 116107 provides for public access to historically significant sites when the landowner is unwilling or unable to conduct proper archaeological investigation." The citation of specific legal statutes suggested that the Morrisons had done extensive homework about their rights to search Marcus's property. They'd apparently consulted attorneys and researched precedents that would allow them to override his objections to their treasure hunting activities. Dorothy moved closer to Marcus, her voice low enough that the officials couldn't overhear. "Marcus, they're not going to go away, and they're going to keep bringing more people and more legal pressure until they find what they're looking for. Maybe it's time to stop hiding what we're doing and start controlling it." The suggestion made sense from a strategic standpoint, but it also meant revealing the container before Marcus had determined how to open it or remove its contents safely. Once the buried vault became public knowledge, he'd lose any control over the recovery process. Dr. Hayes had moved closer to the excavation site and was studying the ground with professional attention to details that Marcus hoped weren't visible through their hasty camouflage efforts. "Mr. Whitfield, I'm detecting soil displacement patterns that suggest mechanical excavation to a depth of several feet. This level of disturbance requires immediate archaeological oversight to prevent damage to potential historical artifacts." Marcus made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "Dr. Hayes, you're correct that excavation has taken place on this site, but it's not unauthorized treasure hunting. I'm recovering property that belongs to my family and was deliberately buried by my grandfather and his neighbor in 1962. The statement caused immediate commotion among the assembled officials and treasure hunters. Walsh began writing rapid notes on her clipboard, while Dr. Hayes pulled out his own documentation to record Marcus's admission of excavation activities. Eddie Morrison's expression shifted from frustrated determination to aggressive interest. "Mr. Whitfield, if you found something valuable on this property, Tennessee Finders laws may give our research group rights to a percentage of whatever's recovered." "Mr. Morrison, this isn't abandoned property subject to Finders laws. This is family property that was deliberately hidden by the legal owner of this land. You have no rights to anything that belongs to my grandfather's estate." Dr. Hayes stepped between Marcus and the Morrison group, his archaeological authority apparently taking precedence over treasure hunting claims. Regardless of ownership questions, any historical artifacts discovered on this site fall under state jurisdiction until their significance can be properly evaluated. No removal of materials can take place without archaeological supervision. Marcus felt the situation spiraling beyond his control as multiple parties asserted different types of authority over his grandfather's buried assets. The county wanted regulatory oversight, the archaeologist wanted academic control, and the treasure hunters wanted legal claims to whatever might be valuable. Dorothy stepped forward with the commanding presence of someone who'd spent 8 decades watching neighbors get carried away by greed and bureaucratic overreach. All of you need to calm down and remember that this is private property belonging to Marcus Whitfield. Whatever his grandfather buried here belongs to him by right of inheritance, and the rest of you are trespassing. Walsh consulted her documentation again, reading from what appeared to be legal statute references. Mrs. Kellerman, while property ownership is clear, Tennessee archaeological protection laws supersede private ownership rights when historically significant materials are involved. Any excavation of potential historical sites requires state oversight. Marcus realized that he was facing the same fundamental problem that had created his inheritance crisis in the first place. Modern institutional authority was more concerned with procedural compliance than practical solutions. The officials wanted process and documentation, while the treasure hunters wanted legal technicalities that would give them access to assets they hadn't earned. Dr. Hayes, Marcus said, making another strategic decision. If you want to supervise the archaeological recovery of this site, I'm willing to cooperate. But I want written acknowledgement that any family property discovered here belongs to the Whitfield estate, and I want assurance that legitimate historical research takes precedence over treasure hunting activities. Dr. Hayes exchanged glances with Walsh, both officials apparently recognizing that cooperation with the property owner would be preferable to legal battles over excavation rights. Mr. Whitfield, that arrangement would be acceptable provided that all recovery work follows proper archaeological protocols and that any artifacts of historical significance are properly documented and preserved. Eddie Morrison protested the exclusion of his research group, but Walsh's authority as county enforcement officer took precedence over his claims about finders' rights. Mr. Morrison, you and your associates need to leave this property immediately. Any further trespassing will result in criminal charges. As the treasure hunters reluctantly departed, Marcus felt relief tempered by the realization that his excavation had become an official archaeological project with state oversight and documentation requirements. He'd gained protection from unauthorized treasure hunting, but he'd also lost control over the recovery process. Dorothy helped him remove the tarps from their excavation, revealing the partially exposed steel container to Dr. Hayes's professional scrutiny. The archaeologist's expression shifted from bureaucratic authority to genuine scientific interest as he studied the vault's construction and placement. "This is remarkable," Hayes said, photographing the container from multiple angles. The construction, quality, and burial techniques suggest sophisticated knowledge of preservation methods. This isn't casual treasure hiding. This is professional-level asset protection. Marcus felt pride in his grandfather's thoroughness, even as he worried about the implications of official archaeological involvement. "Dr. Hayes, my family needs to access the contents of this container to address immediate financial obligations. How long will the archaeological documentation process take?" Hayes consulted his own notebook, reviewing protocols for historical site evaluation. "For proper documentation, we'd normally require several days of careful excavation and analysis. However, given the obvious family ownership and the time-sensitive nature of your situation, we might be able to expedite the process." Walsh was already on her phone, apparently coordinating with other county officials about the changed circumstances of the property investigation. Marcus could hear fragments of her conversation, mentions of historical significance, family property rights, and modified enforcement timelines that suggested his cooperation had altered the county's approach to his code violations. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus found himself in the strange position of watching professional archaeologists carefully expose and document the container that he'd discovered through Dorothy's memories and Harold's 60-year-old surveying notes. The modern scientific approach was more thorough than his amateur excavation, but it was also frustratingly slow when he needed immediate access to whatever assets might solve his financial crisis. Dr. Hayes and his assistant worked with precision that Marcus admired but couldn't afford, photographing every detail of the container's position and construction, while carefully removing soil with brushes and small tools that preserved evidence but delayed access to the contents. The locking mechanism appears to be a high-security design from the 1950s or early 1960s, Hayes observed as he documented the vault's features. The combination lock is integrated with the steel construction in a way that suggests custom fabrication, rather than off-the-shelf security equipment. Marcus watched the careful documentation process while his mind raced through possible combination sequences that his grandfather might have chosen. Military service numbers, family birth dates, anniversary dates, any personal information that would be meaningful to Ezra, but not obvious to strangers who might discover the container. As evening approached, Marcus realized that the day's events had fundamentally changed his situation. His secret excavation had become an official archaeological project. His property was now under state historical oversight, and his grandfather's buried assets were subject to documentation requirements that could delay their recovery indefinitely. But he'd also gained protection from treasure hunters and county enforcement actions, and he'd established legal clarity about his ownership of whatever the container might hold. The old-school methods had succeeded in locating the buried vault, but the modern world had imposed its own requirements for accessing the contents. The question now was whether Dorothy's memories about the combination sequence would prove as reliable as Harold's surveying measurements, and whether the assets hidden for 60 years would justify the risk, effort, and complications involved in their recovery. Standing beside his grandfather's exposed vault as professional archaeologists documented its discovery, Marcus realized that some secrets required more than determination and old-fashioned knowledge to unlock. Sometimes, modern expertise and traditional wisdom needed to work together to achieve results that neither could accomplish alone. The test of that collaboration was about to begin. The story follows Marcus Whitfield, who is excavating a hidden container buried by his grandfather, Ezra Whitfield, on his family's property. The container is secured by a combination lock with 4 dials, and Marcus is trying to figure out the combination. His grandfather, who served in World War II, had hidden the container's contents for reasons unknown, and Marcus suspects it holds important personal assets. As night falls and the excavation team works under portable floodlights, Marcus becomes increasingly frustrated with the complexity of the lock, which has 10,000 possible combinations. Dorothy Kellerman, an older woman and longtime acquaintance of Marcus's grandfather, offers some clues. She recalls that Ezra had served on the USS Pennsylvania during the Pacific Theater in World War II, and that he was very proud of his military service. According to Dorothy, Ezra's military experiences were key to understanding the lock's combination, which might be related to specific dates, like his military serial number or significant moments from his service. Dorothy remembers that Ezra had always been sentimental about the day he returned home from the war in late 1945, just after Japan's surrender. He had been discharged officially, but it was his personal homecoming date that Ezra marked as special an emotional moment when he returned to Clarksville, Tennessee. Just before Christmas, the team works to identify possible numbers that could form part of the combination, such as Ezra's military service dates or the day of his return. Dr. Hayes, an archaeologist leading the excavation, offers professional insight into Ezra's naval service, suggesting that Ezra's discharge and arrival dates could be the key. The search for the correct numbers becomes increasingly frustrating, as Marcus lacks the specific documents or military records to confirm these crucial details. As the team debates, the scene becomes tense when headlights appear on the road leading to the excavation site. Marcus recognizes that the arrival of additional vehicles implies official business, and soon, County Sheriff's Deputy Carlson arrives with 2 federal agents from the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC. Marcus is immediately unsettled, sensing that their involvement signals potential complications regarding the recovery of the container's contents. Agent Richard Torres and Agent Sarah Kim, representing the Treasury Department, explain that their interest lies in ensuring that any items discovered on the property comply with federal regulations regarding foreign assets and cultural property. They hint that, given Ezra's military service in the Pacific Theater, there may be foreign objects of questionable origin buried with the personal assets. The presence of the federal agents raises alarms for Marcus, as it suggests that the items his grandfather hid may be subject to repatriation, legal evaluation, or even forfeiture if found to be of foreign origin. Marcus, initially disoriented, asserts that he knows nothing about his grandfather acquiring illegal or foreign items. To him, his grandfather's hidden treasures represent legitimate personal assets, and he is confident that they hold no illicit value. Despite his assurances, the federal agents stress the importance of adhering to proper documentation and evaluation procedures, as federal law requires any potentially foreign artifacts to be reported for legal review. The tension escalates as Dr. Hayes, concerned about the impact on his archaeological project, intervenes, asserting that the excavation is being conducted with the proper academic oversight. He insists that they are following standard archaeological protocols for documenting and recovering any artifacts. However, Agent Kim clarifies that Treasury jurisdiction supersedes archaeological protocols when it comes to foreign assets or potential legal violations. This means that the container's contents must be subject to a government process, regardless of how they were obtained. The involvement of federal agents introduces the risk of legal complications, including asset forfeiture and the possibility that the items Ezra buried might be subject to international repatriation. The more Marcus learns, the more he realizes that what initially seemed like a simple inheritance has now become a maze of bureaucratic red tape and legal jeopardy. Any foreign artifacts found in the container could trigger a complex investigation, and Marcus fears he could lose whatever his grandfather had hidden, even if no wrongdoing had occurred. Despite Marcus's growing frustration, Dorothy defends Ezra's character, insisting that he was an honest man who hid his assets for his family's safety, not for illicit purposes. Dorothy's conviction that Ezra's actions were above reproach offers Marcus some emotional comfort, though he's aware that good intentions won't protect them from the government's legal scrutiny. The situation becomes more complex as the night wears on. Various government entities are involved, each with different jurisdictions over the property, and Marcus realizes that, even if they manage to figure out the combination to the lock, they are now faced with the reality that the contents will be scrutinized by officials from multiple levels of government. The once simple matter of recovering a family treasure now seems to be a minefield of legal and regulatory obstacles. Agent Torres, after further consultation with his partner, outlines the next steps, noting that all discovered items must be photographed and properly documented before removal. Any potential foreign assets will be secured and evaluated for their legal status. Marcus, now overwhelmed, asks whether the process of determining the legal status of the items could lead to their confiscation. Agent Kim explains that foreign assets might be subject to repatriation or legal proceedings, and Marcus is left to grapple with the realization that his grandfather's secret could be lost to legal processes beyond his control. As the situation becomes more bureaucratic, Marcus finds himself unable to escape the complex web of regulations, each designed to oversee and control the recovery of potentially valuable assets. The excavation site, once a quiet family endeavor, has transformed into a formal government operation, with officials scrutinizing every detail of the process. The story ends with Marcus facing the looming challenge of opening the container, knowing that the process will likely expose his family's private affairs to intense legal and institutional scrutiny. The combination lock, which had protected his grandfather's secret for 60 years, now stands as a symbol of the conflict between personal history and modern governmental oversight. Marcus must decide whether to proceed with the opening, knowing that the act could have significant, irreversible consequences. Through this ordeal, Marcus comes to understand that his grandfather's elaborate security measures weren't merely about protecting wealth from thieves or casual discovery. Instead, Ezra had sought to safeguard his assets from a modern world in which bureaucratic authority, legal regulation, and government oversight had the power to disrupt his carefully concealed personal history. Marcus now faces the question of whether he can navigate the tangled web of regulations and reclaim what his grandfather left behind, or if the modern world's demands will strip away the legacy Ezra intended to preserve. Dorothy's eyes suddenly brightened with the clarity of complete recollection. "Marcus, I just remembered something Harold told me about the combination. He said Ezra used the date he stepped off the train, but not the way most people would write it. He used the military format, day, month, year, but only the last two digits of each number." Marcus felt his pulse quicken as Dorothy continued. "October 5th, 10th, 1945, in military format. That would be the 5th/10th of October 45, but Ezra would have used just the last digits, 5045. With trembling fingers, Marcus turned the combination dials to 5045. The mechanism clicked with mechanical precision, and the heavy steel lock disengaged with a satisfying thunk that echoed across the excavation site. Agent Torres stepped forward with his camera ready as Marcus slowly lifted the container's lid. What emerged from the darkness within made every person present fall silent with stunned amazement. The container held items that defied every expectation. Carefully wrapped in oiled cloth were not foreign artifacts or stolen treasures, but something far more valuable: original Civil War-era gold coins, Confederate bonds that had been thought lost to history, and most remarkably, detailed maps and documents showing the location of additional buried caches throughout Tennessee and Kentucky. Dr. Hayes whistled softly as he examined the documents with professional reverence. "These aren't just family assets. These are historical treasures that document a Confederate gold shipment that historians have been searching for since 1865. Your grandfather apparently inherited knowledge about one of the most significant missing treasures in American history." Agent Torres studied the items carefully, but his expression showed relief rather than suspicion. "Mr. Whitfield, these appear to be legitimate American historical artifacts with clear provenance to your family's Civil War ancestors. There are no federal jurisdiction issues here. This is purely a matter of inheritance and historical significance." Marcus lifted out a leather portfolio that contained his great-great-grandfather's journal, documenting how he'd helped hide Confederate Treasury gold from advancing Union forces in the final days of the Civil War. The journal included detailed maps showing 17 additional burial sites across 3 states, sites that had remained untouched for over 150 years. Dorothy smiled with vindication as she watched Marcus examine the documents. "Your grandfather spent 40 years researching your family's Civil War history and quietly locating the additional burial sites. Harold helped him verify the locations using modern surveying equipment. They weren't just hiding personal assets, they were preserving a piece of American history." Dr. Hayes was practically vibrating with academic excitement as he documented the discovery. Marcus, the historical value of these documents alone exceeds anything I've encountered in 20 years of archaeological work. But the potential monetary value of the gold locations they describe could be astronomical. Agent Kim consulted her tablet and nodded to her partner. Mr. Whitfield, preliminary evaluation suggests these items have a combined value that could exceed $300 million when you factor in the historical significance and the additional treasure locations documented in these materials. Marcus felt dizzy as the implications settled over him. His crumbling inheritance hadn't been a burden. It had been the key to one of the most significant treasure discoveries in American history. His grandfather's old-fashioned methods had preserved not just family assets, but a legacy that would transform his life completely. The county's code violations suddenly seemed trivial when measured against resources that could fund not just property restoration, but the establishment of a historical research foundation that would employ archaeologists and historians for generations to come. Deputy Carlson shook his head in amazement. Mr. Whitfield, I've been in law enforcement for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Your grandfather was protecting American history itself. As dawn broke over the property, Marcus called his siblings to share the news. Victoria's voice carried stunned disbelief when he explained the discovery, while Rebecca simply repeated, $300 million? Until the number seemed to sink in. Marcus, Victoria finally managed, I owe you an apology. We were so focused on the costs of maintaining the property that we never considered what grandfather might have been protecting. Rebecca's response was more practical but equally amazed. Marcus, you're going to need legal help, financial advisors, and probably security services. This discovery changes everything about our family situation. But Marcus found himself thinking about Dorothy Kellerman, whose loyalty to old promises had made the discovery possible, and about his grandfather's faith that traditional knowledge and careful preparation would eventually prove their worth against any modern challenge. The restoration of the farmhouse began 6 months later, but not as an expensive burden to be endured. Instead, it became the centerpiece of the Whitfield Historical Foundation, a research institution dedicated to preserving Civil War history and supporting archaeological education throughout the Southeast. Dorothy Kellerman became the Foundation's first historian emeritus, her memories and Harold's surveying notes forming the basis for additional treasure recoveries that funded scholarships for young people interested in historical preservation and traditional trades. Marcus never forgot the lesson his inheritance had taught him. Sometimes the most valuable knowledge can't be measured by modern tools or verified by professional consultants. Sometimes wisdom comes from listening to people who remember how things used to be done. Even when the modern world insists those methods are obsolete, the old ways hadn't just survived the challenge from sophisticated systems and institutional authority. They had proven superior to contemporary methods in every way that mattered. Experience, patience, and respect for traditional knowledge had succeeded where computers, experts, and bureaucratic procedures had failed. Standing on the restored porch of his grandfather's farmhouse, watching archaeologists and historians work to unlock the secrets of 17 additional treasure sites, Marcus realized that his inheritance had been about more than money. It had been about choosing between the certainty of modern expertise and the possibility that some secrets were worth preserving for people willing to dig deeper than surface appearances suggested. His siblings' mockery had transformed into respect. The county's violations had become opportunities for historical preservation, and his grandfather's faith in traditional methods had been vindicated in the most spectacular way possible. If this story of hidden wisdom triumphing over modern assumptions inspired you, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. We share incredible true stories like this every week that will change how you think about conventional wisdom and forgotten knowledge. Hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments, What family secrets or old wisdom have you discovered that modern experts overlooked? Your story could be featured in our next video. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most valuable treasures are hidden in the places where modern thinking refuses to look.